Apache Martinez, a 35-year-old wildlife rescuer living in the remote mountains of Northern California, has spent his entire life dedicated to saving injured and abandoned animals. Running a small sanctuary on his late father's land, Apache lives a solitary existence, haunted by the loss of his wife Maria and their unborn child 3 years ago in a tragic accident. His only companions are the animals he rescues and his aging dog, Scout. One freezing winter morning, Apache discovers massive footprints near his property and hears strange, mournful cries echoing through the forest. The local townspeople believe it's the legendary Bigfoot that has been spotted in the area for generations. When Apache finally encounters the creature, a towering, fur-covered being standing over 8 feet tall, he realizes it's injured and terrified. Against all logic and the warnings of the frightened locals, Apache decides to help the creature, bringing it back to his largest kennel. But as Apache cares for the creature he names Gentle, he discovers something extraordinary. The creature is fiercely protective of the back corner of its kennel, growling and becoming agitated whenever Apache comes near. What Apache eventually uncovers hidden there will not only change his understanding of this mysterious being, but will also heal the deepest wounds of his broken heart, teaching him that family comes in the most unexpected forms and that love and protection transcend all boundaries of species and understanding. The first snowfall of December came early that year, blanketing the mountain peaks in a thick white silence that seemed to muffle even the whisper of the wind through the pine trees. Apache Martinez stood on the wooden porch of his cabin, a steaming mug of black coffee warming his calloused hands as he watched the sun struggle to break through the heavy gray clouds. At 35 years old, his face carried lines that made him look older, etched deep by grief and the harsh mountain weather. His dark hair, pulled back in a ponytail, showed streaks of premature silver at the temples, and his brown eyes held a distant sadness that never quite left, even when he smiled, which wasn't often anymore. The sanctuary sprawled across 15 acres of his late father's land, a patchwork of kennels, enclosures, and rehabilitation spaces that Apache had built with his own hands over the past decade. Chain-link fences enclosed areas for injured deer, wooden structures housed recovering birds of prey, and several large kennels provided temporary homes for bears, cougars, and other predators that needed care before being released back into the wild. It wasn't much to look at. No fancy signs or visitor centers like the big wildlife rehabilitation places down in the valley. But it was honest work, and it kept Apache's hands busy and his mind from wandering too far into the dark places where memories live. Scout, his 12-year-old German shepherd, limped across the porch and pressed his graying muzzle against Apache's leg. The dog had been with him through everything, through Maria's death, through the endless nights of grief, through the slow rebuilding of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Apache reached down and scratched behind Scout's ears, feeling the familiar comfort of the dog's presence. Scout had arthritis now, moved slower than he used to, but his eyes were still sharp and his loyalty unwavering. "Another cold one, boy," Apache murmured, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "We better check on the animals before it gets worse." He drained the last of his coffee and set the mug on the porch railing, then pulled on his heavy work coat, the one with the torn pocket that Maria had always meant to fix, but never got around to. He kept it that way, the tear, as a small reminder of all the unfinished things in life, all the plans that never came to be. His work boots crunched through the fresh snow as he made his way toward the kennels, Scout following behind at his own careful pace. The morning feeding routine was something Apache could do in his sleep. He'd done it so many times that his body moved on autopilot while his mind drifted. He checked on Maple, a young doe who'd been hit by a car 2 weeks ago and was recovering well. Her leg was healing nicely, and she'd probably be ready for release by spring. Then he moved to the bird enclosure where a red-tailed hawk with a broken wing watched him with fierce, intelligent eyes. Apache had named her Scarlet, and she was getting stronger every day, testing her wing with small flaps that would soon become powerful enough to carry her back to the sky. It was when he reached the far edge of the property, near the tree line where the forest grew thick and dark, that he noticed something was wrong. The snow here was disturbed, not by the usual patterns of deer or elk, but by something else entirely. Apache knelt down, his breath catching in his throat as he examined the prints. They were enormous, easily twice the size of his own boot, with 5 distinct toe marks that pressed deep into the snow. The stride between prints was impossibly long, suggesting a creature of considerable height and weight. Scout whined nervously, his ears pinned back against his head as he sniffed the air. The dog's hackles rose, and he took several steps backward, clearly uncomfortable with whatever scent he was picking up. Apache had learned to trust Scout's instincts over the years. If the dog was scared, there was good reason to be cautious. "Easy, boy," Apache said softly, though his own heart was beating faster now. "Let's see what we're dealing with." He followed the tracks deeper into the tree line, his hand instinctively reaching for the bear spray he always carried on his belt. The prints led in a wandering path, sometimes stopping abruptly as if the creature had paused to listen or look around, other times breaking into what appeared to be a lumbering run. Branches were broken at heights that Apache couldn't reach, even if he jumped, and there were places where the bark had been stripped from trees, revealing the pale wood underneath. The sun was higher now, but the forest remained dim, the thick canopy of evergreens blocking out most of the light. Apache's breath came in steady clouds as he tracked the prints for nearly a quarter mile. Scout stayed close, his anxiety evident in the way he pressed against Apache's leg with every few steps. Then Apache heard it, a sound that stopped him cold and sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a cry, low and mournful, echoing through the trees like nothing Apache had ever heard before. It wasn't the roar of a bear or the scream of a cougar. It was something else entirely, something that sounded almost human in its pain and loneliness, but with an underlying resonance that was decidedly not human at all. The cry came again, longer this time, and Apache felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Scout barked once, sharp and urgent, and turned to head back toward the cabin. But Apache stood frozen, listening as the cry faded into silence. His scientific mind, the part of him that had studied wildlife biology in college before his father's death, had brought him back to the mountains, told him to be rational. There were no unknown large mammals in North America. Whatever was making that sound had a logical explanation, but another part of him, the part that had grown up listening to his grandmother's stories about the old spirits that lived in these mountains, wasn't so sure. He decided to head back to the cabin, to get better equipment and maybe his rifle, just in case. As he turned to follow Scout's retreating form, he noticed something else. There was blood in the snow, dark drops that stood out starkly against the white. Not much, but enough to suggest that whatever had left these prints was injured. Apache's instinct as a rescuer immediately kicked in, overriding his caution. An injured animal was an animal in need, regardless of what species it was. The blood trail led away from the path he'd been following, deeper into an area of the forest that Apache rarely visited because it was thick with undergrowth and fallen trees. He pushed through the brush, his coat snagging on branches, his boots slipping on hidden ice beneath the snow. The blood drops became more frequent, and Apache's concern grew. Whatever this creature was, it was hurt badly enough to be leaving a steady trail. Then he saw it, in a small clearing where an old lightning-struck pine had fallen years ago, creating a natural shelter with its massive trunk and exposed roots. There was movement. Apache froze, his hand on his bear spray, his eyes trying to make sense of what he was seeing. At first he thought it was a bear, perhaps a grizzly, though they were rare in this area. But as his eyes adjusted to the shadows, he realized it was something else entirely. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall, even though it was crouched low in the shelter of the fallen tree. Its body was covered in thick, dark brown fur that was matted with snow and what appeared to be dried blood. The proportions were all wrong for a bear, the arms too long, the shoulders too broad, the shape of the head too rounded and set atop a neck, rather than the low-slung profile of a bear. And then the creature turned its head, and Apache found himself staring into a face that would haunt his dreams for weeks to come. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't quite animal either. The face was flatter than a gorilla's, but more pronounced than a human's, with a broad nose, deep-set eyes that gleamed with intelligence and pain, and a mouth that opened to reveal large, flat teeth. The creature made a sound, not the mournful cry Apache had heard earlier, but a low rumble that might have been a warning or might have been a plea. Its right arm was cradled against its chest, and Apache could see now that the fur there was matted with fresh blood. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Apache's mind was racing, trying to categorize what he was seeing, trying to make it fit into his understanding of the natural world. But there was no category for this, no neat label he could apply. The townspeople called it Bigfoot, Sasquatch. The old-timers had a dozen different names for it. Apache had always dismissed the stories as folklore, the kind of tales that got embellished with every telling, but here it was, real and solid and bleeding in front of him. The creature shifted slightly, and Apache saw it wince with pain. That small, very human gesture of suffering broke through his shock. This was an animal in distress, and Apache had spent his entire adult life helping animals in distress. The how and why of what this creature was could wait right now. It needed help. "Easy," Apache said softly, using the same calm tone he used with frightened animals. "I'm not going to hurt you. Let me see what's wrong." The creature's eyes fixed on him, and Apache felt the weight of its gaze. There was something deeply unsettling about looking into those eyes, something that suggested a level of awareness that went beyond simple animal intelligence. The creature made another sound, softer this time, almost questioning. Then slowly it extended its injured arm slightly, as if showing Apache the wound. Apache took a cautious step forward, his hands held out in a non-threatening gesture. Scout had caught up with him now and was standing at the edge of the clearing, whining anxiously, but not approaching. The dog's fear was palpable, but Apache pushed his own fear aside, focusing on the practical matter at hand. The creature's arm had a deep gash, probably from a fall, or perhaps from fighting with another animal. The wound was serious enough to need treatment, but not immediately life-threatening, if it could be cleaned and bandaged properly. "I have supplies back at my place," Apache said, still using that calm, steady voice. "I can help you, but you'll need to trust me." The creature tilted its head, and Apache could have sworn he saw understanding in its eyes. It was impossible, he told himself. Animals didn't understand human language like that. But then again, everything about this situation was impossible. The creature made a decision that Apache couldn't quite comprehend the reasoning behind. It slowly, painfully, began to stand up to its full height. Apache had to tilt his head back to look at its face. The creature was enormous, at least 8.5 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as a door frame. Its arms hung down past its knees, and its hands, though proportionally similar to human hands, were twice the size. Every instinct Apache had was screaming at him to run, to get away from this thing that shouldn't exist. But he held his ground, watching as the creature took a tentative step toward him. "That's it," Apache encouraged. "Come on, I'll help you." The journey back to the sanctuary was surreal. The creature followed Apache at a distance, moving with a strange, loping gait that suggested it was trying to minimize the pain in its injured arm. Scout stayed close to Apache, occasionally looking back at their unusual follower with worried eyes. Apache's mind was churning with questions and concerns. What was he going to do with this thing? Where would he keep it? What if it became aggressive? What if someone from town saw it? The stories about Bigfoot sightings had caused enough trouble over the years, with amateur hunters and cryptozoologists tramping through the forest, disturbing the wildlife. and sometimes causing dangerous situations. When they reached the sanctuary, Apache led the creature to his largest kennel, a structure he'd built 2 years ago to house an injured black bear that had needed several months of recovery before being released. The kennel was essentially a large wooden barn with reinforced walls and a concrete floor, divided into 2 sections with a heavy sliding door between them. One section was an indoor space with heating, and the other opened to a large outdoor enclosure. It was the most secure and spacious facility he had, and if anything could safely contain this creature, this was it. The creature hesitated at the entrance, its large eyes scanning the interior with obvious wariness. Apache opened the door wide and stepped inside, gesturing for the creature to follow. For a moment he thought it would refuse, thought it would turn and lumber back into the forest. But then, with what seemed like a deep breath of resolve, the creature ducked its head and entered the kennel. The space seemed smaller with the creature inside. It stood in the center of the indoor section, looking around at the plain walls, the pile of clean straw in one corner, the large water trough, and the feeding area. Apache moved slowly and deliberately, showing the creature that he meant no harm. He pulled out his first aid kit, the large one he kept for emergencies, and approached the creature carefully. "I need to clean that wound," Apache explained, even though he wasn't sure how much the creature understood. "It's going to sting a bit, but it'll help." To his amazement, the creature lowered itself to the ground, sitting cross-legged like a person would, and extended its injured arm toward Apache. The gesture was so human, so deliberate, that Apache felt a lump form in his throat. This wasn't just an animal, this was something more. Something that understood cooperation and trust in a way that went beyond simple conditioning. Apache worked carefully, cleaning the wound with antiseptic solution, while the creature watched him with those unsettling, intelligent eyes. The gash was deep, but clean, and Apache was able to bandage it securely after applying antibiotic ointment. The creature never made a sound during the entire process, though Apache could see tension in its massive shoulders and the way its free hand gripped the edge of its knee. "There," Apache said finally, tying off the bandage. "That should help. You need to keep it clean and dry." The creature examined the bandage with obvious curiosity, turning its arm this way and that to look at Apache's work. Then it did something that made Apache's breath catch. It reached out with one massive hand and gently, almost reverently, touched Apache's shoulder. The gesture lasted only a moment, but it carried a weight of meaning that transcended language. It was thanks, it was trust, it was acknowledgement of kindness received. Apache left the kennel with his mind reeling, securing the heavy door behind him. Scout was waiting outside, and together they walked back to the cabin as the afternoon light began to fade. Apache knew he should report this, should call someone, maybe the university or the wildlife department. But who would believe him? And more importantly, what would they do if they did believe him? This creature would become a specimen, a curiosity, something to be studied and possibly exploited. Apache had seen what happened to rare animals when humans got too interested in them. No, he decided, for now, this would remain his secret. He would care for the creature, help it heal, and then he would let it go back into the wild, where it belonged. It was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. He had no way of knowing then, standing on his porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, that this decision would lead him down a path that would change everything he thought he knew about loss, about family, and about the strange ways that love finds us when we least expect it. That night, Apache couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin settling and the wind moving through the trees. But his mind was out in that kennel, wondering about the creature he'd locked inside. Was it frightened? Was it anxious? Was it in pain? Around midnight he gave up on sleep entirely and pulled on his coat and boots. The sanctuary was quiet under the moonlight, the snow reflecting the pale glow and making everything look ethereal and strange. Apache made his way to the large kennel, moving quietly so as not to disturb the other animals. He approached the door and stood there for a moment. He could hear movement inside, the soft sound of something large shifting position, and then, unexpectedly, that mournful cry he'd heard in the forest. But this time, it was different. This time it was muffled, as if the creature was trying to be quiet, trying not to be heard. It was crying, Apache realized with a jolt. This massive, impossible creature was crying in the darkness of its enclosure. And the sound was so full of loneliness and pain that Apache felt tears spring to his own eyes. He understood that kind of grief, that kind of soul-deep sorrow. He'd lived with it for 3 years, ever since the night the police had knocked on his door to tell him about the accident, about Maria, about the baby they'd been expecting, about how quickly everything that mattered could be taken away. "I know," Apache whispered to the door, knowing the creature couldn't hear him, but needing to say it anyway. "I know how it feels." He stood there for a long time, listening to the creature's quiet grief, and felt something shift inside his chest. He wasn't alone in his pain anymore. Whatever this creature was, wherever it had come from, it understood loss, and maybe, just maybe, they could help each other heal. The next morning arrived, with a bitter cold that made the windows of Apache's cabin frost over in intricate patterns that looked like frozen ferns. Apache had managed only a few hours of restless sleep, his dreams filled with images of massive shadows moving through snow-covered trees and eyes that held too much understanding to belong to any animal he'd ever known. He woke before dawn, as he always did, and lay in bed for a moment listening to Scout's steady breathing from his dog bed in the corner. The events of yesterday felt surreal in the grey pre-dawn light, and for a brief moment Apache wondered if he'd imagined the whole thing, if grief and isolation had finally caught up with him and manufactured an impossible encounter to fill the emptiness in his life. But when he walked out to the kennel an hour later, carrying a bucket of fresh water and a basket of food he'd hastily assembled, the reality of the situation came crashing back. The creature was real, very real, and it was sitting in the far corner of the indoor section of the kennel, its long arms wrapped around its knees, watching the door with those deep-set eyes that seemed to look right through Apache and into some deeper truth he couldn't quite grasp. The morning light filtering through the high windows caught the creature's fur, revealing shades of brown and amber that Apache hadn't noticed in the dimness of the forest. There were patches of silver around its face, suggesting age, and the way it held itself with a careful dignity despite its obvious discomfort reminded Apache of an elderly person trying to maintain composure through pain. Apache opened the smaller access door that allowed him to enter the indoor section without opening the main kennel door. The creature didn't move, didn't react with aggression or fear, just watched him with that unsettling intensity. Apache set down the water bucket and the food basket, which contained apples, carrots, some leftover bread, nuts, and strips of dried venison. He had no idea what this creature ate, whether it was herbivore or omnivore, or something else entirely, so he'd brought a variety and hoped something would appeal to it. "Good morning," Apache said, feeling foolish for talking it but unable to help himself. Years of working with animals had taught him that tone mattered more than words, and there was something comforting in maintaining the routine of conversation, even when the listener probably couldn't understand. "I brought you some food. I'm not sure what you like, so I brought options." The creature's eyes moved from Apache's face to the basket of food, and Apache saw its nostrils flare as it caught the scent. Its nostrils flare as it caught the scent. The moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the creature unfolded itself from its sitting position and moved toward the food, with a cautiousness that suggested it still wasn't entirely sure this wasn't some kind of trap. It moved on all fours for a few steps, its long arms making the gait look surprisingly natural before rising to its full height as it reached the basket. Apache took several steps back, giving the creature space, and watched as it knelt down and began to examine the food. It picked up an apple first, turning it over in its massive hands with a delicacy that seemed at odds with its size, and then bit into it with a crunch that echoed in the enclosed space. The creature chewed slowly, thoughtfully, and then reached for another apple, and then some carrots. It ignored the bread entirely and showed only passing interest in the venison, which told Apache something important. This creature was primarily, if not entirely, vegetarian. Fruit and vegetables, then, Apache murmured to himself, making mental notes. I can work with that. As the creature ate, Apache took the opportunity to really observe it. In the better light of morning, he could see details he'd missed yesterday. The hands, despite their size, had fingernails rather than claws, blunt and worn like those of something that dug or climbed regularly. The feet were broad and flat, designed for balance and stability on rough terrain. The face, while definitely not human, had an expressiveness that was startling. He could see the creature's mood in the set of its mouth, the slight narrowing of its eyes, the way its brow furrowed slightly as it ate. And there was something else, something that took Apache a moment to identify. The creature looked tired, not just physically exhausted, but emotionally drained, as if it had been running or hiding for so long that it had forgotten what it felt like to rest. You're alone, aren't you? Apache said softly. You've been alone for a long time. The creature paused in its eating and looked at him, and Apache felt that strange connection again. That sense of mutual recognition between two beings who knew what it meant to live with loneliness as a constant companion. The moment stretched between them, silent and oddly intimate, before the creature returned to its meal. Apache spent the next hour in the kennel, changing the straw bedding in one corner to make a more comfortable resting area, checking the heating system to ensure the temperature stayed comfortable, and refilling the water trough. The creature watched his every movement but made no attempt to approach or interact beyond that initial eye contact. When Apache finally left, securing the door behind him, he felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. This wasn't like caring for an injured deer or a bear with a wounded paw. This was something unprecedented, something that existed in the gray area between known and unknown, between animal and something more. The rest of the morning was consumed by the usual sanctuary work, but Apache's mind kept drifting back to the creature in the large kennel. He fed the other animals, cleaned enclosures, administered medications to those who needed them, and checked on the healing progress of his various patients. Scout followed him through the routine, but even the old dog seemed distracted, occasionally looking toward the large kennel with an expression that Apache couldn't quite interpret. Was it still fear, or was it curiosity? Maybe it was both. Around noon, Apache heard the sound of a truck coming up his long driveway, and his heart sank. He didn't get many visitors, especially not in winter, and the timing couldn't be worse. He walked around to the front of the cabin and saw Tom Wilson's battered red pickup rolling to a stop. Tom was the closest thing Apache had to a friend these days, a retired forest ranger in his 60s who lived about 5 miles down the mountain and occasionally stopped by to check on Apache and share whatever news was circulating in town. Tom climbed out of his truck, a tall man with a weathered face and gray hair hidden under a worn baseball cap. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose knees had seen too many years of hiking rough terrain. And he carried a thermos that Apache knew from experience contained coffee strong enough to strip paint. "Morning, Apache," Tom called out, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Thought I'd stop by, see how you're managing with this cold snap." "Morning, Tom," Apache replied, walking over to meet him and hoping his voice didn't betray the anxiety he was feeling. "I'm managing fine. Animals are all good." Tom poured coffee from his thermos into the spare cup he'd brought and handed it to Apache. "Good to hear. Town's been buzzing with talk. Old Mary Hutchins claims she saw something in the woods yesterday morning, something big moving through the trees near her property. You know how she gets. Says it was the Bigfoot. Says it was heading up toward your place." Apache felt his stomach tighten but kept his expression neutral. Mary Hutchins was a widow who lived on the edge of town, and she was known for her stories about seeing unusual things in the forest. Most people dismissed her claims as the ramblings of a lonely old woman, with too much imagination and not enough company. But Apache had always suspected that Mary saw more than people gave her credit for. "Mary sees a lot of things," Apache said carefully, sipping the coffee and trying to sound casual. "Last month she was convinced she saw a black panther, and the month before that it was a wolf the size of a horse." Tom chuckled and nodded. "That's true enough, but this time there's more to it. Jim Davidson was out checking his traps in the northern section yesterday, and he found tracks, said they were the biggest prints he'd ever seen. Definitely not bear or elk or anything normal. He took some photos, been showing them around town. Got people all worked up, talking about organizing a search party, maybe even calling in some of those cryptozoology folks from the university." Apache felt a cold dread settling in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. A search party was the last thing he needed. That seems like an overreaction. Could just be a big bear walking on its hind legs. "I've seen that before." "That's what I told them," Tom agreed, leaning against his truck. "But you know how people get when they're bored and winter's setting in. They want excitement, want something to talk about. Sheriff Bennett is trying to keep a lid on it, doesn't want a bunch of amateur hunters tramping through the forest, taking shots at shadows, but I'm not sure how long he can hold them off." They talked for a few more minutes, Apache doing his best to seem unconcerned while internally calculating how quickly news would spread and how much danger the creature might be in if people started seriously looking for it. Tom eventually finished his coffee, said his goodbyes, and climbed back into his truck. Apache watched him drive away, the red pickup disappearing down the winding driveway, and felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him even harder than before. He spent the afternoon reinforcing the security of the large kennel, adding extra locks to the doors and hanging tarps over some of the windows to make it harder for anyone to see inside if they happened to wander onto his property. He also spent time thinking about what he was going to call the creature. He couldn't keep referring to it as the creature or it in his mind. That felt disrespectful somehow, reducing something clearly intelligent and aware to the status of an object. He thought about the way it had cried in the darkness, about the gentleness with which it had touched his shoulder, about the profound loneliness he'd seen in its eyes. "Gentle," Apache said aloud, testing the name. "I'll call you Gentle." It felt right. Despite its enormous size and strength, despite the fear it could inspire simply by existing, there was a gentleness to the creature that Apache had recognized from that first encounter in the forest. It had been in pain, frightened, vulnerable, and yet it had extended its injured arm to him in trust. That took a kind of courage and gentleness of spirit that deserved recognition. That evening Apache brought dinner to the kennel, another basket of fruits and vegetables, along with some cooked sweet potatoes and a small amount of honey, which he'd read somewhere that bears loved and thought Gentle might enjoy. When he entered the indoor section, he found Gentle sitting in the same corner as before, but this time the creature's attention wasn't on Apache or the food. Instead, Gentle was focused intently on the back corner of the kennel, the area that was partially obscured by shadows, despite the overhead lights. Apache set down the food and watched Gentle, noticing for the first time that there was something odd about the creature's behavior. Gentle kept glancing at that back corner, kept shifting position as if trying to block Apache's view of it, and there was a tension in Gentle's massive shoulders that suggested protectiveness, maybe even anxiety. When Apache took a step in the direction of that corner, just out of curiosity about what had captured Gentle's attention, the creature made a sound, a low rumble that was definitely a warning. "Okay," Apache said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not going over there. Whatever you've got going on in that corner is your business." Gentle's posture relaxed slightly, though those intelligent eyes remained watchful, tracking Apache's every movement. Apache finished his tasks and left the kennel, but his mind was working on this new development. What was in that corner that Gentle was so protective of? Was there something there? Or was it just that Gentle had claimed that space as a safe zone and didn't want Apache intruding? Apache had seen similar behavior in animals before, especially in creatures that had been traumatized or were recovering from injuries. They would claim a specific spot as their own and become aggressive if that space was violated. But something about this felt different. The way Gentle kept looking at that corner, the specific nature of the protectiveness, it reminded Apache of something else entirely. It reminded him the way his old dog, Scout's predecessor, had behaved when she'd had puppies. The way she would position herself between the puppies and anyone who approached, the way she would watch with that same intense focus to make sure no harm came to what she was protecting. Was Gentle protecting something? Was there something in that corner that Apache couldn't see in the shadows? The thought nagged at him as he went through his evening routine, feeding Scout, making himself a simple dinner that he barely tasted, and trying to settle into his usual nighttime activities. But he couldn't focus on anything. His mind kept returning to that corner, to Gentle's behavior, to the mystery of what this creature might be hiding. Around 10 o'clock, Apache made a decision that he knew was probably foolish, but couldn't resist. He pulled on his coat, grabbed a flashlight, and headed back out to the kennel. The night was clear and brutally cold, the kind of cold that made every breath feel like inhaling knives. The stars overhead were brilliant, undimmed by any light pollution this far from civilization, and the moon was 3/4 full, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. Apache approached the kennel quietly, moving slowly so as not to startle Gentle. He could see through a gap in the tarp he'd hung over one window that the interior lights were still on, set to a dim level for nighttime. He carefully unlocked the access door, opened it just wide enough to slip inside, and stepped into the warm interior of the kennel. Gentle was awake, sitting with its back against the wall in that protected corner, and the creature's eyes locked onto Apache immediately. But this time there was something different in Gentle's expression. It wasn't just wariness or protectiveness. It was fear, raw and unmistakable, the kind of fear that came from having something precious to lose. Gentle made a sound, not quite a growl, but close, a warning that was also a plea. "I'm not here to hurt anything," Apache said softly, holding up his hands to show they were empty, except for the flashlight. "I just want to understand. I want to help." He took a slow step forward, then another, watching Gentle's reaction carefully. The creature's body language was screaming at him to stop. Every muscle tensed and ready to move, but Apache kept going, drawn by a curiosity that overrode his common sense. He raised the flashlight, directing its beam toward the corner that Gentle was so desperately guarding, and what he saw in that circle of light made him freeze, made his breath catch in his throat, made the entire world seem to shift on its axis. There, nestled in a carefully arranged pile of straw and what appeared to be soft moss that Gentle must have brought from outside before Apache had found the creature, was a baby. Not a human baby, but not entirely like Gentle either. It was smaller, covered in fine downy fur that was lighter than Gentle's, with tiny hands that were curled into fists, and a face that was simultaneously alien and heartbreakingly familiar. The baby was sleeping, its small chest rising and falling with each breath, completely unaware of the drama unfolding around it. Apache stood frozen, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. Gentle had a baby. That's what this was all about. That's why the creature had been alone in the forest, injured and desperate. That's why Gentle had cried in the darkness of the kennel. That's what Gentle had been protecting with such fierce determination. The baby looked to be very young, maybe only a few weeks old at most, and it was clear from the way Gentle was positioned, from the intensity of that protective gaze, that this baby was everything to Gentle, the entire reason for existence, the one thing worth fighting for in a world that had probably taken everything else away. Apache breathed, and in that single syllable was contained a universe of understanding. He lowered the flashlight slowly, not wanting to disturb the sleeping infant, and looked at Gentle with new eyes. This wasn't just a creature, wasn't just an animal, to be studied or helped and released. This was a mother, fighting to keep her baby safe, in a world that would never understand them, never accept them, never let them live in peace, if their existence became known. Gentle was watching him with an intensity that was almost painful, waiting to see what Apache would do with this knowledge, waiting to see if this human, who had shown kindness, would now become a threat. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and danger, with the weight of trust and the fragility of hope. Apache slowly sat down on the floor of the kennel, making himself smaller, less threatening. He set the flashlight aside, pointing it away from the corner so it provided only ambient light, and looked at Gentle with all the honesty and compassion he could muster. "I understand now," he said quietly. "You're not just protecting a secret in that corner. You're protecting your whole world, and I promise you, Gentle, I won't let anyone hurt your baby. I won't let anyone take this away from you." Gentle's eyes, those deep and impossibly expressive eyes, seemed to search Apache's face for a long moment. Then, in a gesture that Apache would remember for the rest of his life, Gentle slowly, carefully, moved aside just enough to give Apache a clearer view of the sleeping infant. It was an offering of trust, a bridge being built between two different kinds of beings who had both known loss and both understood what it meant to protect the things that mattered most. Apache sat there in the quiet warmth of the kennel, watching the baby sleep and feeling something crack open inside his chest, some part of himself that had been frozen solid since Maria's death beginning to thaw. He thought about his own child, the one who had never been born, the one who had died with Maria in that terrible accident. He thought about all the dreams he'd had, all the plans for a family that had been destroyed in an instant. And now here he was, sitting in a kennel with a creature that shouldn't exist, making a promise to protect a baby that the world would call impossible. Life had a strange way of giving you what you needed rather than what you wanted, Apache thought. He'd lost his chance at fatherhood, but maybe, just maybe, he was being given another kind of purpose, not as a father, but as a protector, as someone who could stand between the innocent and the dangers of a world that feared what it didn't understand. "We'll figure this out," Apache said to Gentle, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know how yet, but we will. You and me, we'll keep your baby safe." Gentle made a sound, soft and low, that might have been agreement, or might have been simply acknowledgement. But the tension had gone out of the creature's shoulders, and there was something in Gentle's expression that looked almost like relief. They sat together in the quiet kennel as the night deepened outside, two beings from different worlds united by the universal language of love and protection, both of them carrying wounds that might never fully heal, but maybe, just maybe, could be survived together. Apache eventually left the kennel, stepping out into the freezing night with his mind reeling and his heart feeling things he'd thought were dead and buried. Scout was waiting on the porch, and together they went inside the cabin, where it was warm and safe. But Apache knew that everything had changed. This wasn't just about helping an injured animal anymore. This was about protecting a family, about keeping a secret that could destroy the very things he was trying to save if it ever got out. He lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling again, but this time his insomnia came from planning rather than grief. He needed to figure out how to keep Gentle and the baby safe, how to provide for them, how to make sure that when the time came for them to return to the wild, they would have everything they needed to survive. It was a monumental task, probably an impossible one, but Apache had never been one to back down from impossible challenges. His whole life had been a series of impossible situations that he'd somehow managed to survive. This would just be one more. As he finally drifted off to sleep in the early hours of the morning, Apache's last conscious thought was of that tiny baby sleeping in its nest of straw and moss, completely dependent on the fierce love of its mother and the unexpected protection of a man who had thought his capacity for caring had died 3 years ago. Sometimes he thought, The world gave you a reason to keep going right when you needed it most. Sometimes survival meant finding something worth protecting, even if that something was impossible, unexplainable, and would require every ounce of courage and determination you had left. The days that followed took on a rhythm that Apache had never experienced before. A strange new routine that revolved around two impossible creatures who had somehow become the center of his entire world. He woke each morning before dawn, made his coffee in the quiet darkness of the cabin, and then headed out to the large kennel while the rest of the world still slept. Those early morning hours became sacred to him, a time when he could sit with Gentle and the baby without worrying about unexpected visitors or the prying eyes of townspeople who might wander onto his property. The baby, whom Apache had started calling Little One in his mind, though he suspected Gentle might have her own name for the infant, was growing stronger each day. Apache had initially worried that the stress of captivity and the injury Gentle had suffered might affect the baby's health, but his concerns proved unfounded. The little creature was thriving, nursing regularly from Gentle and spending increasing amounts of time awake, studying the world with curious dark eyes that reminded Apache of a human infant, but with something else lurking behind them, some spark of awareness that seemed almost preternatural. Gentle's arm was healing well, the gash closing cleanly thanks to Apache's careful treatment and the creature's own remarkable constitution. Apache changed the bandages every other day, and Gentle had learned to extend the injured arm without prompting, sitting patiently while Apache worked. There was an understanding between them now, built on those quiet morning visits and the shared knowledge of the secret they were protecting. Gentle seemed to recognize that Apache was not a threat, but an ally, and gradually the creature's wariness began to transform into something that looked almost like trust. It was on the 5th morning after discovering the baby that Apache arrived at the kennel to find Gentle standing near the access door, waiting for him with Little One cradled carefully in those massive arms. The sight stopped Apache in his tracks, his hand frozen on the door handle. Gentle had never approached the door before, had always maintained a careful distance, keeping to that protected corner where the baby's nest was located. But now here was Gentle standing in plain sight with the most precious thing in the world held close. And when Apache opened the door, Gentle didn't retreat. "Good morning," Apache said softly, his heart hammering in his chest. He stepped inside slowly, giving Gentle plenty of space to move away if the creature wanted to, but Gentle remained still. Apache could see Little One more clearly now than he ever had before. The baby was awake, those dark eyes following Apache's movements with an intensity that was startling in something so young. The infant's fur was a soft caramel color, lighter than Gentle's darker brown, and there was a distinctive patch of white on the baby's chest that looked almost like a star. Gentle made a sound, a series of low vocalizations that Apache had come to recognize as communication, though he had no idea what was being said. But the tone was clear enough. It was introductory, almost formal, as if Gentle was making a conscious decision to truly show Apache the baby, rather than just allow glimpses from a distance. Apache stood very still, hardly daring to breathe, as Gentle took a step closer, and then another. "She's beautiful," Apache whispered, using the female pronoun instinctively, though he had no way of knowing if it was accurate. Something about the baby just seemed feminine to him, in the delicacy of her features and the way she moved her tiny hands. "You're doing such a good job taking care of her." Gentle's eyes met his, and Apache saw something in them that made his throat tighten with emotion. It was gratitude, pure and simple, the kind of thankfulness that came from a mother who had been alone and afraid and had found unexpected help. She needed it most. Gentle shifted, Little One slightly, adjusting her position with the practiced ease of someone who had held this baby countless times, and then did something that made Apache's eyes fill with tears. Gentle extended her arm slightly, not quite offering the baby to Apache, but bringing Little One close enough that Apache could reach out and touch her if he chose to. It was an invitation, a gesture of profound trust that transcended the barriers of species and language. Apache slowly raised one hand, giving Gentle plenty of time to pull back if this was too much, and gently touched one finger to Little One's tiny hand. The baby's fingers, each no bigger than Apache's fingernail, curled around his finger with a strength that surprised him. Little One made a small sound, something between a coo and a chirp, and those dark eyes studied Apache's face with what seemed like recognition, as if the baby somehow knew that this human was a friend, was safe, was part of the small circle of protection that Gentle had drawn around her offspring. They stood like that for a long moment, connected by the simple touch of finger to hand, three beings from two different worlds, sharing a moment of pure understanding. Apache felt something shift inside him, felt the walls he'd built around his heart after Maria's death beginning to crumble. He'd thought he would never feel this again, this fierce protective love, this overwhelming need to keep something small and precious safe from all harm. But here it was, washing over him in waves, and it didn't matter that Little One wasn't human, that this situation was impossible and complicated and potentially dangerous. All that mattered was this tiny creature looking up at him with trust in her eyes, and the mother who had chosen to share this moment with him. "I won't let anyone hurt her," Apache said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I promise you, Gentle. Whatever it takes, I'll keep both of you safe." Gentle seemed to understand, or at least to sense the sincerity in Apache's words. The creature made a sound that was almost like a sigh, a release of tension that suggested just how much weight Gentle had been carrying alone. Then, carefully, Gentle stepped back and returned to the corner where Little One's nest was located, settling down with the baby and beginning to nurse her. Apache watched for a moment, awed by the simple normalcy of the scene, a mother feeding her child, the most universal act in all of nature, and then quietly left the kennel to begin the rest of his morning routine. But as he walked across the snow-covered ground toward the other animal enclosures, Apache's mind was already working on the problems that lay ahead. Gentle and Little One couldn't stay in the kennel forever. Eventually they would need to return to the wild, to whatever hidden place Gentle had come from, wherever others of her kind might exist. But Little One was so young, too young to survive the harsh mountain winter, too vulnerable to be exposed to the dangers of the forest. They would need to stay at the sanctuary at least until spring, maybe longer, and that meant Apache had to find a way to keep their presence secret for months. The situation in town wasn't making things easier. Tom stopped by again 3 days later, and this time he brought troubling news. The excitement over the mysterious tracks hadn't died down as Apache had hoped. Instead, it had intensified. A group of men from town, led by Dale Morrison, a logger with more enthusiasm than sense, had organized a search party. They'd been combing the forest for the past 2 days, looking for any sign of the creature that had left those massive prints. "They haven't found anything yet," Tom said, leaning against his truck and sipping his ever-present coffee. "But Dale's got his blood up. He's convinced there's something out there, and he's bound and determined to find it. Says if it's real, if there's really a Bigfoot living in these mountains, it would put this town on the map. He's talking about calling in news crews, making a whole spectacle of it." Apache felt his stomach churn. That's insane. Even if there was something out there, which there probably isn't, the last thing it needs is a bunch of people with guns tramping through its territory. "I agree with you," Tom said, "but try telling that to Dale. He's got half the town excited about the possibility. Even got some young fool from the university interested, some graduate students studying cryptozoology or some such nonsense. The kid's driving up here next week with all kinds of equipment, cameras and sensors, and who knows what else." This was worse than Apache had feared. A bunch of local men searching the forest was bad enough, but someone with actual scientific equipment, someone who knew what to look for and how to find it, that was a serious threat. Apache needed to make sure Gentle and Little One stayed completely hidden, and he needed to be careful about his own behavior. Any indication that he knew something, any slip in his carefully maintained ignorance about the whole situation, and people might start asking questions he couldn't answer. That night, Apache sat at his kitchen table with a notebook and a pen, trying to think through every possible scenario. If someone came onto his property, which they had no legal right to do but which wouldn't necessarily stop them if they were excited enough, they would see the large kennel. Apache used it rarely enough that its current occupied state wouldn't be immediately suspicious, but if someone insisted on looking inside, if someone caught even a glimpse of gentle or little one, everything would fall apart. He spent the next day reinforcing the security of the kennel even further. He installed a heavy padlock on the main door and added a second lock to the access door. He hung more tarps and attached them more securely so they couldn't be easily pulled aside. He even went so far as to hang a sign on the door that read, "Quarantine, aggressive animal under treatment. Do not approach," hoping that would discourage casual curiosity. It wasn't much, but it was something. The following week brought the first real test of these precautions. Apache was in the middle of feeding the injured doe when he heard the sound of multiple vehicles coming up his driveway. His heart sank as he recognized Dale Morrison's loud truck, leading a convoy of 3 other vehicles. Apache wiped his hands on his jeans and walked around to the front of the cabin, positioning himself in a way that would make it difficult for the visitors to simply drive past him toward the rest of the sanctuary. Dale climbed out of his truck, a big man in his 40s with a red face and a booming voice that carried across the clearing. "Apache, hope you don't mind us stopping by. We're doing a systematic search of the area, checking in with everyone who lives up in these mountains." "Searching for what exactly?" Apache asked, though he knew the answer. "You haven't heard. We've got definitive proof that there's a Bigfoot living somewhere in this range. Tracks, broken branches at heights no bear could reach, even some hair samples we found caught on a tree. We're organizing a proper search grid, and your property is right in the middle of the most likely territory." Apache crossed his arms and leaned against the porch railing, projecting a calmness he absolutely did not feel. "Dale, you know how I feel about people tramping around my sanctuary. I've got injured animals here, and they're easily stressed. The last thing they need is a bunch of commotion." "We'll be respectful," Dale promised, though his eyes were already scanning the property, taking in the various enclosures and buildings. "Just need to take a look around, make sure nothing's hiding out in your outbuildings or kennels. You understand, right? This is important." "I understand that you're trespassing on private property," Apache said, his voice hardening slightly. "And I'm going to have to ask you to leave. If you want to search the forest around my land, that's your business, though I think you're wasting your time. But my property is off limits." Dale's friendly expression faltered slightly. "Now, Apache, there's no need to be difficult about this. We're all on the same side here. Don't you want to know if there's some dangerous creature living up here? If there is, which I seriously doubt, it hasn't bothered me or my animals," Apache replied. "And I'd prefer to keep it that way by not having a search party stirring everything up. Now I've asked you politely to leave. Don't make me ask again." There was a tense moment where Apache thought Dale might argue further, might try to push past him and search the property anyway, but then Tom Wilson's truck pulled into the driveway, and the older man climbed out with a purposeful expression on his face. "Dale, what are you up here?" Tom asked, his tone casual, but his body language suggesting he wasn't asking out of mere curiosity, just trying to conduct a thorough search. Dale said, his defensiveness evident. "But Apache here is being uncooperative." "Apache's being smart," Tom corrected. "He's got a legal right to refuse entry to his property, and frankly, I think he's making the right call. You boys have been stomping through these woods for a week now, and what have you found? Nothing but normal animal tracks, and your own overactive imaginations." Dale's face reddened further. "Those tracks were real, Tom. You saw the photo." "I saw photos of large prints that could have been made by any number of things, including a bear walking funny, or someone playing a prank," Tom said. "What I didn't see was actual evidence of anything unusual. Now, I think it's time you and your search party moved along. You're making Apache uncomfortable on his own property, and that's not neighborly. The standoff lasted another moment before Dale finally backed down, grumbling under his breath about uncooperative neighbors and missed opportunities. The convoy of vehicles turned around and headed back down the driveway, leaving Apache and Tom standing in the clearing as the sound of engines faded into the distance. "Thank you," Apache said quietly. "I appreciate you showing up when you did." Tom studied him with those sharp eyes that missed very little. "You seemed more nervous than usual just now. Dale's an idiot, but he's mostly harmless. There's something going on I should know about." Apache chose his words carefully. "I've just got some animals in delicate condition right now. Last thing they need is stress from a bunch of people poking around. You know how it is." Tom nodded slowly, but Apache could see he wasn't entirely convinced. "Just be careful, Apache. This whole Bigfoot business has people stirred up. And when people get excited about something, they don't always think straight. If you need help with anything at all, you know where to find me." "I do," Apache said. "And I appreciate it, Tom. I really do." After Tom left, Apache allowed himself a moment of relief before the anxiety came crashing back. That had been too close. If Dale had pushed harder, if Tom hadn't shown up when he did, things could have gotten very complicated. Apache needed to be more careful, needed to have better plans in place for dealing with unwanted visitors. That evening, Apache spent extra time in the kennel with Gentle and Little One. He told Gentle about what had happened, about the men who were searching for her, about the danger they represented. He didn't know how much Gentle understood, but the creature listened intently, those intelligent eyes fixed on his face, and Apache felt certain that some level of comprehension was occurring. Little One was more active now, spending time crawling around the nest area on unsteady limbs, exploring her small world with the fearless curiosity of all young things. She had started making more vocalizations, little chirps and coos, and sometimes sounds that were almost like laughter when Gentle played with her, gently tickling her belly or making faces that seemed designed specifically to delight an infant. Watching them together, Apache was struck again by how universal parenthood was, how the bond between mother and child transcended every boundary of species and biology. "You're a good mother," Apache said to Gentle. "The best. Little One is lucky to have you." Gentle reached out and touched Apache's hand, a gesture that had become more common over the past week. It was a simple touch, just fingertips to knuckles, but it carried layers of meaning. It was thanks, it was trust, it was acknowledgement of everything Apache was doing to keep them safe. And it made Apache more determined than ever to protect them, no matter what it cost him. The next challenge came from an unexpected direction. 3 days after Dale's visit, Apache received a phone call from someone identifying himself as Marcus Chen, the graduate student Tom had mentioned. Marcus was polite and enthusiastic, explaining that he was doing his doctoral research on cryptid sightings in North America, and that the recent reports from this area had attracted his attention. He wanted to interview Apache, to ask about any unusual experiences or sightings, to get the perspective of someone who lived in the mountains and knew the wildlife intimately. Apache agreed to the interview, partly because refusing might seem suspicious and partly because he wanted to get a sense of what Marcus knew and what he was looking for. They arranged to meet at the cabin 2 days later, which gave Apache time to prepare, to think through his story, to make sure everything at the sanctuary looked normal and unremarkable. Marcus Chen arrived precisely on time, driving a small sedan that was comically unsuited for mountain roads, but had somehow made it up the driveway intact. He was younger than Apache had expected, probably in his late 20s, with dark hair, glasses, and an eager expression that reminded Apache of an excited puppy. He carried a backpack stuffed with notebooks, recording equipment, and what appeared to be various scientific instruments. "Mr. Martinez, thank you so much for agreeing to see me," Marcus said, shaking Apache's hand enthusiastically. "I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you must be busy with the sanctuary." They sat on the cabin's porch despite the cold, Apache reasoning that staying outside would make it harder for Marcus to ask for a tour of the facilities. Scout lay between them, occasionally lifting his head to study their visitor with mild interest. Apache made coffee, and they talked for over an hour about the mountains, about wildlife preserve, about the history of cryptid sightings in the region. Marcus was sharp. Apache had to give him that. His questions were thoughtful and probing, but never felt aggressive or accusatory. He wanted to understand the ecosystem, the patterns of animal movement, the ways that misidentification could occur. He showed Apache photos of the tracks that had been found, and Apache had to work to keep his expression neutral, as he recognized them immediately as Gentle's footprints. "What do you think made these?" Marcus asked, watching Apache's face carefully. Apache studied the photos for a long moment, as if considering seriously. "Could be a lot of things. Bear walking on hind legs. Unusual snow conditions making normal tracks look bigger. Even someone with large boots deliberately creating hoax prints. I've seen all of that before, but you don't think it could be an unknown primate?" Marcus pressed gently. "I think if there was a breeding population of 8-foot-tall primates living in these mountains, we would have found definitive evidence by now," Apache said, which was technically not a lie. "There probably wasn't a breeding population, just Gentle and Little One, alone and isolate. The logistics don't work. What would they eat? Where would they shelter? How would they avoid detection with all the hikers and hunters and people who work in these forests?" Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Those are all valid points. But theoretically, if such a creature existed, how do you think it would survive?" Apache allowed himself to think about Gentle, about what he'd learned over the past weeks. It would need to be omnivorous, primarily vegetarian but able to supplement with protein when available. It would need to be intelligent enough to avoid human contact, to understand the danger humans represent, and it would need to be incredibly rare, maybe just a few individuals scattered across a huge territory, which would explain why sightings are so infrequent and why we've never found a body or captured one. "That's a really thoughtful analysis," Marcus said, making notes in one of his many notebooks. "Have you personally ever seen anything unusual in these mountains? Anything that you couldn't explain?" This was the dangerous question, the one Apache had been preparing for. He met Marcus's eyes steadily and said, "I've seen a lot of things in my years up here that took me a while to figure out. Strange sounds that turned out to be foxes mating, massive tracks that were from a bear with an unusual gait, shadows that were just tricks of the light through the trees. The mountains can be deceptive, especially when you're alone and your imagination starts working overtime. But no, I've never seen anything that I couldn't eventually explain through normal wildlife activity." It was a carefully constructed answer, full of truth, but missing the one crucial detail that made all the difference. Apache could see Marcus processing it, weighing it, trying to determine if Apache was being completely honest. But apparently Apache's performance was convincing enough, because Marcus eventually nodded and moved on to other questions. Before Marcus left, he asked if he could set up some camera traps on Apache's property, motion-activated cameras that would photograph anything that moved past them. "Just on the perimeter," Marcus explained. "I'm setting up a grid covering several square miles, and your property is right in the center of the hot zone. It would really help complete the coverage." Apache wanted to refuse, but he knew that would seem suspicious. Instead, he agreed, but insisted that Marcus stay away from the immediate area around the sanctuary buildings, citing the stress it would cause his recovering animals. Marcus readily agreed, and they spent another hour walking the property line, identifying good spots for cameras that would give Marcus his data without pointing toward the large kennel where Gentle and Little One were hidden. Parting words stayed with him. The young man had looked at him with those sharp, knowing eyes and said, "If you ever do see something unusual, something that doesn't fit the normal patterns, I hope you'll do what's right. Not what's expedient or profitable, but what's right." "I will," Apache had promised, and he'd meant it with every fiber of his being. The days grew incrementally longer as February progressed, each sunset coming a few minutes later than the day before. Apache watched the changing light with mixed feelings. Spring would bring the possibility of release for Gentle and Little One, the chance to return them to the wild where they belonged. But it would also mean saying goodbye, and Apache wasn't sure he was ready for that. Little One had become such a part of his daily life, her cheerful greetings in the morning and her playful antics filling spaces in his heart he'd thought were permanently empty. And Gentle, with her quiet dignity and deep understanding, had become something like a friend, a confidant who listened to all his stories about Maria and his father and never judged, never pitied, just understood. Tom stopped by regularly, always bringing news from town and usually staying to visit with Gentle and Little One. The older man had become genuinely attached to them, especially to Little One, who had learned that Tom's pockets often contained treats, usually apple slices or carrots, that she would accept with delighted chirps. Watching Tom interact with the baby, seeing the gentleness in the weathered ranger's face, Apache thought about how wrong people were to assume that differences in species mattered more than the capacity for kindness. It was Tom who brought the news that Dale Morrison had given up his search. He's moved on to some other obsession. Tom reported one evening in late February, something about a conspiracy involving the Forestry Service. You're off his radar, at least for now. Apache felt relief wash over him, but Tom's expression suggested there was more to the story. What else? Mary Hutchins passed away last week, Tom said quietly. Heart attack in her sleep. She was telling stories right up until the end, talking about the forest spirits and the creatures that lived in the mountains. Most people thought she was senile, but I always wondered if maybe she saw more than we gave her credit for. Apache thought about the old woman who had reported seeing something moving through the woods toward his property, the sighting that had started this whole chain of events. Had Mary seen Gentle? Had she understood what she was seeing? There was no way to know now, but Apache hoped that wherever Mary was, she knew that the creatures in her stories were real, and that someone was retit them. March arrived with the first real signs of spring. The snow began to melt in earnest, creating rushing streams where none had existed before, and exposing the brown earth beneath. The animals in Apache's sanctuary became more active. Sensing the changing season, the injured doe was ready for release, and Apache spent a morning preparing her, checking her healed leg one final time before opening the enclosure and watching her bound away into the forest with graceful leaps that showed no sign of her former injury. Little One was walking confidently now, even attempting to climb using the rough wooden walls of the kennel. She had grown considerably, probably weighing close to 40 pounds, and her coordination had improved dramatically. She still had the proportions of a baby, with oversized hands and feet and a rounded belly, but Apache could see the creature she would become taking shape. Her personality had emerged fully, showing a curious and playful nature tempered by surprising moments of gentleness, like when she would carefully touch Apache's face or bring gentle offerings of straw, arranged in patterns that might have been attempts at gifts. Gentle's arm had healed completely, leaving only a faint scar beneath the thick fur. The creature was restless now, pacing the kennel at night, standing at the windows for long periods, staring out at the forest. Apache knew what this meant. Gentle was ready to leave, needed to leave, but was staying because of Little One, because the baby still needed the security and protection of the shelter Apache had provided. One evening in mid-March, Apache sat with Gentle and Little One and broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind for weeks. "You need to go back," he said quietly. "Both of you. The weather is warming. Little One is strong enough, and you can't stay here forever. You were meant for the wild, for freedom, not for living in a kennel no matter how comfortable I try to make it." Gentle looked at him with those expressive eyes, and Apache saw understanding there, and sadness, and something that looked like reluctance. Little One, not comprehending the gravity of the conversation, was playing with a collection of pine cones that Apache had brought in for her, arranging them in lines and knocking them down with obvious pleasure. "I've been thinking about where to take you," Apache continued. "Tom's property is about 15 miles north of here, deep wilderness that no one goes to even in summer. There's shelter there, caves and dense forest, and plenty of food sources. I could take you there. Make sure you have everything you need to re-establish yourself." Gentle reached out and took Apache's hand, holding it gently in both of her massive ones. The gesture was so human, so full of meaning, that Apache felt his throat tighten with emotion. They had been through so much together, had formed a bond that defied every logical explanation, and now they had to face the hardest part, letting go. "I'll miss you," Apache said, his voice breaking slightly. "Both of you. These months with you have given me something I thought I'd lost forever. You've reminded me what it feels like to care about something beyond my own pain, to have a purpose that matters. I don't know how to thank you for that." Gentle made a sound, low and mournful, and pulled Apache into what could only be described as a hug. The creature's arms wrapped around him, careful despite their strength, and Apache hugged back, pressing his face against Gentle's fur and letting the tears fall that he'd been holding back for so long. They weren't just tears for Gentle and Little One, weren't just tears for the goodbye that was coming. They were tears for Maria and the baby he'd lost, tears for his father and all the things left unsaid, tears for the lonely years and the healing that had finally begun. Little One, sensing something important was happening, abandoned her pine cones and crawled over to them, wrapping her small arms around both Apache and Gentle as if trying to hold them all together. The three of them sat like that in the quiet warmth of the kennel, a strange family united by circumstance and love, knowing that their time together was running out but grateful for every moment they'd had. They spent the next week preparing for the journey to Tom's property. Apache packed supplies, planned the route, and coordinated with Tom to make sure the way would be clear. They decided to make the move at night when there was less chance of being seen, and to travel through the densest parts of the forest, where even the most dedicated hikers rarely venture. The night they chose was clear and cold, with a half moon providing enough light to navigate by without needing flashlights that might draw attention. Apache loaded a backpack with supplies for Gentle and Little One, food and basic necessities that would help them through the first few weeks in their new location. Gentle carried Little One, the baby clinging to her mother's fur with the instinctive grip of all primate young. The journey took most of the night. They moved slowly, carefully, Apache leading the way through terrain he knew well from years of hiking these mountains. Gentle followed, moving with surprising silence for something so large, and Little One stayed quiet against her mother's chest, perhaps sensing that this was a time for caution rather than play. Tom met them at the edge of his property, a shadow among shadows, until he stepped forward into the moonlight. He'd prepared one of the caves on his land, bringing in firewood and arranging a sheltered area that would provide immediate protection while Gentle established a more permanent home. The three of them worked together in silence, setting everything up, making sure Gentle and Little One had what they needed. When everything was ready, when there was nothing left to do but say goodbye, Apache found himself unable to speak. He looked at Gentle, at Little One sleeping peacefully against her mother's chest, and felt his heart breaking in a way that was different from the devastation of Maria's death. This was a chosen loss, a necessary sacrifice, but it hurt no less for being the right thing to do. Gentle touched his face one last time, those massive fingers gentle against his skin, and then turned and walked into the cave, disappearing into the shadows with Little One. Apache stood watching the darkness where they'd vanished, his chest tight with unshed tears. "You did good," Tom said quietly, placing a hand on Apache's shoulder. "You saved them. You gave them a chance at the life they were meant to have." "I know," Apache said, his voice rough, "but knowing it's right doesn't make it hurt any less." They hiked back through the pre-dawn darkness, arriving at Apache's cabin, just as the sun was beginning to paint the eastern sky with streaks of pink and gold. Apache felt exhausted, emotionally drained in a way that went beyond mere physical tiredness. He'd done what he set out to do, had protected Gentle and Little One, and given them their freedom, but the victory felt hollow, colored by the ache of loss. The sanctuary seemed too quiet in the days that followed. Apache went through his routines mechanically, caring for the other animals with his usual competence, but feeling like he was moving through a fog. Scout seemed to sense his depression, staying closer than usual, pressing against Apache's leg whenever he sat down. Even the old dog seemed to miss their unusual family members. 2 weeks after releasing Gentle and Little One, Apache was working on repairing the roof of one of the smaller kennels when Tom's truck came up the driveway at a speed that immediately triggered Apache's alarm. Tom climbed out looking pale and shaken, and Apache felt his stomach drop. "What happened? Are they okay?" "They're fine," Tom said quickly, holding up his hands. "But Apache, you need to come with me. There's something you need to see." They drove to Tom's property in tense silence, Apache's mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. When they finally hiked to the cave where Apache had left Gentle and Little One, Tom gestured for silence and led Apache to a vantage point where they could observe without being seen. What Apache saw made his breath catch in his throat. Gentle was there, and Little One, but they weren't alone. There was another creature with them. Slightly smaller than Gentle but unmistakably the same species. And this new creature was holding a baby of its own, an infant even smaller than Little One had been when Apache first discovered her. "They found each other," Tom whispered. "Gentle wasn't alone after all. There are others. Apache. A family." Apache watched as Gentle and the other creature interacted, their body language speaking of familiarity and affection. Little One was playing with the new baby under the watchful eyes of both mothers, and the scene was so domestic, so ordinary despite its impossibility, that Apache felt tears streaming down his face. "She has a family now," Apache said, his voice choked with emotion. "She's not alone anymore." They watched for a while longer, seeing Gentle interact with her companion with obvious joy and relief. Apache thought about all the nights he'd heard Gentle crying in the darkness, all the loneliness he'd seen in those expressive eyes, and now understood that it hadn't just been grief for the past, but longing for others of her kind, for connection and community that Apache couldn't provide no matter how much he cared. As they turned to leave to give the small family their privacy, Apache took one last look at the cave entrance. Gentle emerged from the shadows for just a moment, as if she'd sensed his presence. Their eyes met across the distance, and Apache saw in Gentle's gaze everything that needed to be said. It was gratitude and farewell, recognition and it was the acknowledgement that sometimes love meant letting go, that protection sometimes meant stepping back and allowing those you cared about to live their own lives in their own way. Apache raised one hand in a small wave, and Gentle returned the gesture, a mirror of his own movement that drove home just how similar they really were beneath all the surface differences. Then Gentle turned and went back into the cave, back to her family, back to the life she was meant to live. The drive back to the sanctuary was quiet, both men lost in their own thoughts. When they reached Apache's cabin, Tom turned to him with serious eyes. "What we saw today, what you did for them, it needs to stay secret. Maybe forever. The world isn't ready for this. Might never be ready." "I know," Apache agreed, "and I'm okay with that. Some things are too precious share, too fragile to expose to a world that wouldn't understand. Let them have their hidden life, their freedom. That's worth more than any fame or recognition." After Tom left, Apache walked out to the large kennel where Gentle and Little One had lived for those transformative months. He stood in the empty space, remembering everything that had happened there, all the small moments and major milestones, the straw bed where Little One had slept, the corner where Gentle had first revealed her most precious secret, the spots worn smooth by their constant presence. All of it held memories that Apache knew would stay with him for the rest of his life. He thought about Maria, about how she would have loved this story, would have been amazed and delighted by Gentle and Little One. He thought about the baby they'd lost, about all the dreams that had died with Maria, and realized that while the pain of that loss would never completely disappear, It had transformed into something he could live with, something that no longer defined every moment of his existence. Gentle and Little One hadn't replaced what he'd lost. They couldn't do that, and it would be wrong to expect them to. But they had given him something equally precious. They had reminded him that his capacity for love hadn't died with Maria, that he could still care deeply and fiercely, that he could still find purpose and meaning in protecting those who needed protection. They had saved him just as surely as he had saved them, and that gift was beyond measure. Apache locked the kennel for the last time and walked back to his cabin, where Scout was waiting on the porch. The old dog wagged his tail, and Apache knelt down to scratch behind his ears, grateful for this loyal companion who had been with him through everything. "Just you and me now, boy," Apache said softly. "Just like before, except not really like before, because everything's different now. Better, I think. Definitely better." That night Apache slept deeply for the first time in years, without nightmares or restless turning. He dreamed of forests and families, of mothers protecting their young and communities coming together against all odds. He dreamed of Little One taking her first steps and Gentle's gentle touch on his shoulder. He dreamed of Maria smiling at him with approval, telling him without words that she was proud of what he'd done, of the man he'd become in the years since losing her. When he woke the next morning, Apache felt lighter somehow, as if a burden he'd been carrying for 3 years had finally been set down. He made his coffee and stood on his porch, watching the sunrise paint the mountains with gold and rose. The sanctuary spread out before him, full of animals who needed his care and protection, full of purpose and possibility. Life would go on, as it always did. There would be new animals to rescue, new challenges to face, new seasons to navigate. But Apache faced it all with a renewed sense of hope and connection to the world around him. He had been given an extraordinary gift, the chance to be part of something impossible and beautiful, and he would honor that gift by continuing to protect and nurture the wild things that most people never saw or understood. Somewhere out in those mountains, in a hidden cave that would never appear on any map, a family of impossible creatures was living their lives in peace and safety. And Apache, standing on his horse with the sun on his face and his faithful dog by his side, knew that he had played a part in that miracle. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.